Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are on this planet Earth. We are here with another special edition of WOWSA Live with our host, Ned Dennison. Ned?
Hello, everyone. My guest today is an honoree of the International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame, and I'm currently the chairman of that organization. I'll ask him to introduce himself by, first of all, telling you a little bit about his marathon swimming background. David Clarke from Southern California, please say hello.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Stevens Clarke. I am from San Diego, California. I have been involved with marathon swimming for many, many years. I first got started in swimming with the Lakewood Aquatic Club with Jim Montrella. Swam in high school and college. Didn't really do open water until I was on a whale watching trip and went out to the Coronado Islands off the coast of Mexico. And looked back at the mainland and thought, well, that looks interesting. I wonder how far it is. And eventually ended up swimming from Coronado to the mainland. A couple of years later, met up with a couple of people named John York and Penny Dean, who were very helpful in advising me on training for Catalina and lining up paddlers. And then a couple of years after that, swam the English Channel. Managed to get across that. Had a little bit better swim than I had had at Catalina based on learning from the experience of Catalina, and was able to get across England in 9 hours, 47 minutes, which for me I thought was a pretty reasonable time.
So David, you kind of went under the radar on your swimming for a few decades, and you ended up being incredibly involved in the Catalina Association. Give us a rough idea of how many Catalina swims you've been involved with as an observer or a crew from, year X to year Y?
Well, I've only done one solo swim myself. I have organized and swum on 5 single relays and 1 relay that went around the island. But then as a coach, as an observer, and also as a paddler, I've been on somewhere over 150 Catalina swims. And also have coached or swum on relays on about half a dozen English Channel swims and other swims in places around the world, including David Udeman's swim across the Sunda Strait in Indonesia, and swam on a relay across the North Channel in the Irish Sea a few years back, and have had some adventures in various places around the world. Over about a 20-year period before Catalina swims became incredibly popular, I actually had been on over half of all Catalina swims that occurred up until about 2000, over a 20-year period ending in about 2004. And just for comparison, at the end of 2004, the grand total of people who had swum Catalina was 112. There were 5 that year, and we thought 5 was a pretty good year. At the end of last year, there had been a total of 573, and we had 70 swims that year. And 2/3 of those were from people who were from overseas. So Catalina Channel swim has really become very popular in just the last decade or so.
For our listeners, hopefully you've had the responsibility and pleasure of crewing for somebody in your time. And I think you'll all agree with me that the first time you crew for somebody, you learn a whole lot. The second time you crew for somebody, you learn at least half as much, and every time you do it, you learn something else. What I'm going to ask you, David, and for this section you can use names if you want, give us the best of your observations, what people have done well. Whether they be the swimmers, the captains, the crew, the kayakers, what have people done well?
I'll be happy to do that, but I would like to back up and refer to your comment about learning half again as much on the second swim. After I'd been on, 10 or 15 swims, I kind of started to think I'd pretty well seen what there was to see and had a fairly clear idea of what to expect. I could not possibly have been more wrong. There was so much more to learn. I learned something on every swim I go on, and you just never stop learning. There is always more to learn. So even after 150 swims, it doesn't get old, and I don't feel like I would be a fool to think I knew everything. That would be ridiculous. Really what it comes down to as far as best swims that I have been a coach or a observer or a paddler for, it'd be unsurprising to hear that it all comes down to training and preparation, but also having a support crew that understands what they're doing. If you have an experienced support crew, everything can go really smoothly. And just the moment you start to form in your mind the idea that something needs to happen, 2 or 3 other people start to have the same idea, and it all just kind of keeps on happening and works very, very well. If you have an inexperienced crew, if they are open to learning some things that they might not have known, that can work out pretty well, but it's obviously going to be rougher. And then in the unusual case, every once in a while you have somebody who has not done this before but is convinced that they don't need any help, and then things can get really awkward. Some of the best swims. I've had the pleasure of being on some incredible swims. I paddled all the way across for Pete Husfeldt when he did his record swim of 7 hours, 37 minutes. Everybody always thinks that he must have had incredibly good conditions, but actually he was going into the Whitecaps on a rough night, and I have always wondered how much faster he would have gone if we'd been going with the waves instead of against them. I also ended up paddling all the way across for Chad Hundeby when he set a record at the time of 8:14. Had the pleasure of paddling as a support person for the U.S. national long distance team when Penny Dean was coaching it, and went 7:02 for the Catalina crossing. But there have been a lot of other really memorable swims, things that especially come to mind. As an example, Carlos Costa, who was a double above the knee amputee, a teenager from Canada, just a tremendous attitude. Really just a pleasure to work with the guy, and really good swimmer, and just, gosh, he made it look easy. I remember especially Jim McConaughey, who's swum Catalina I don't know how many times. It's just a tremendous, tremendous athlete. And David Udevin, another guy who's done swims all around the world. We miss David very much. Rick Nepper comes to mind. He was a guy who had been swimming for a long time, not an elite swimmer, but very focused and determined, and had a bunch of different injuries and medical problems that he had to overcome. And he's very systematic, very thoughtful about working his way through things. And I remember late in his swim, as we all know, it's great to work on stroke technique, but when you start to get really exhausted, people's stroke faults tend to come to the fore again, and they end up showing up with the problems that they've been working with their coach for months to try to eliminate. Rick was, you could see him as he's swimming. You could just about see him thinking his way through the stroke, maintaining all of the corrections that he'd been working on for so long. He was just so focused and so intense and so determined. It was an amazing thing to see, and he ended up having a very successful swim under difficult conditions, and it was just one of those things that really stays with me.
Thank you very much. One of the things you mentioned was the phrase experienced crew. And for people listening, we'd like to hope that the English Channel, Catalina, et cetera, are not going to be your first big swim. And the way you help train yourself and your crew is you take the same people on your first 10K swim, your first 15K, your first 20K, and then by the time you get to something like Catalina, you've actually got some experience and you know each other a little bit better. David, again, this time leave out names. The worst of your observations that you've seen personally. What are the worst things people have done?
Things that I've witnessed myself. Basically, any swim that ends in a hospital is a bad swim, no matter how fast you went. The worst one that I have personally been involved with was a swimmer who had trained hard. He was quick but not elite speed. He was in competition with another swimmer who had swum Catalina just not very long before and wanted to swim faster than that other swimmer. And on the day, and I had paddled for him on things like 15-mile training swims, so I was well familiar with his swimming. On the day, he went out faster than he had trained for. And on the boat, we were saying, you need to slow down. You haven't trained for this. You need to slow down. And he was feeling strong and enthusiastic and wanted to go real fast, and he would not slow down. And he was quite quick for about the first 2/3, maybe 3/4. And then he ran out of gas and got a whole lot slower over the course of the next few hours. He was still oriented and alert. One of the things we do to monitor people is we will ask them questions. We have a thing called the rule of 5 that we use to ask people to, if we're going to show them some number of fingers, like 3 fingers, we want them to subtract that number from 5 and tell us the result. So if we show 3 fingers, we want them to say 2 because they've subtracted 3 from 5 and got 2. And that just shows that they're not just merely able to recall data like their phone number, but they actually can think a little bit. And he was oriented and alert, but then very abruptly he collapsed, and it turned out that exhausted and cold as he was, he had aspirated seawater. You swim through a million whitecaps, and if you breathe one of them, you go from being a very tired athlete to being a drowning victim in about 1 second. And he ended up in the ICU, intensive care unit, that is. It was a terrible situation. He certainly could have died. He was in the ICU for a couple of days and in the hospital for about a week. Managed to recover, thank God, but without any kind of lasting effects. And I should say also he came back a couple of years later and succeeded, swam Catalina again and made it across safely. But that's the worst one I personally have been involved in. And it changed my attitude. I used to think that no swim was worth dying for, and I revised my attitude on that basis. I now think that not only is no swim worth dying for, no swim is worth a trip to the emergency department. It's just not worth it. You don't want to go that close to the edge.
Any particular bad experiences when the crew included a fairly young child or a fairly elderly parent that may not have been in the best of health?
No, nothing like that really. We did have one swimmer who was 74 years old when he decided to come across. We were not familiar with his swimming, which has some influence on our decision process. We're going to be more conservative, perhaps, if we don't know anything about the swimmer. And in some cases, if we knew somebody really well and we were confident that they were basically intact and doing fine, we might encourage people to keep on going. In this case, when the gentleman decided that he was feeling a bit discouraged, we didn't try to talk him out of getting out, and he got out, and that was that, and he was fine.
As I travel the world, David, doing swims in various places, I was struck by several things in Catalina. The first thing is that the weather is usually pretty accommodating, and you can go at the time you want. But the second thing is that everything about Catalina to me seemed a notch above in terms of safety. Small things like you insist on two observers on the basis that you wouldn't have a truck driver driving for 14 hours without a break. Most of the other swims I've been on, you have one observer. The boats were bigger and cleaner. There were some positive sort of communication before somebody threw themselves in the water. It wasn't just enough to somebody yell to the captain, "I'm going to go in and swim with them now." It was a positive kind of thing. You had a lead role for decades in the Catalina safety. Tell us about some of the things that you folks decided and the basis on which you decided them.
I guess really it would be fair for me to say that the thing that really first got me started on thinking a lot about how to improve safety on these things was my experience when I was in England to swim the English Channel. The tide before I was scheduled to swim, a young woman from Brazil, Renata Agondi, lost her life. I was standing on Shakespeare Beach watching her coach help her get ready to start her swim, and I saw her and the other people swimming that day swim off into the distance. Came back to Dover Harbor, to the training area the next day, and was staggered to hear that she had lost her life. And in reviewing all of the particulars that I was able to learn, the thing that kept coming back to me was this didn't have to happen. This was preventable. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how you prevent these things. So a variety of things that we have done, the Catalina Channel Swimming Federation, it was founded in 1981 by Penny Dean and John York and a number of other folks who have been a tremendous role model and mentor for me. We reorganized as a nonprofit in 2007, and it's been a fantastic group to work with. We do a variety of things. I wrote an observer's manual, a guide for observers, everything that you needed to be aware of, look out for, and that has subsequently been expanded tremendously and revised by all of us on the Federation Board of Directors. I should perhaps mention that I am one of the 7 directors of the CCSF. So we do training classes for observers. I also started a training class for paddlers to show paddlers how to paddle for a swimmer. There's obviously a great deal more to it than knowing how to paddle a kayak or a paddleboard. So I started that and have been doing that annually for, over 20 years. My gosh, it's 25 years now. I also wrote a checklist for swimmers and paddlers so that if you, say, go to an out-of-town swim and you don't have your own paddler with you and you are introduced to some kind-hearted volunteer who's agreed to help you by paddling for you on the morning, 20 minutes before the sun goes off, you can rapidly go through all the particulars that apply and try to get things organized so you're not out there swimming, getting past, trying to explain to your paddler what you need. The Federation, wrote another document called Plan Your Swim, Swim Your Plan. The idea is for people to systematically lay out what they expect to do on a swim. One of the things that we're concerned about is some folks who are experienced swimmers, as you say, people who've had the good sense to do some 10K swims with their own support crew before. Those are the kind of folks we love to see. If we have people who are less experienced or haven't really done all that much, we will ask some additional questions. I wrote another document, Questions for Marathon Swimmers, to address things that people may not have thought about. And I call people up and we have a fairly extended conversation on the phone. And I cover motivation, experience, training, feeding and nutrition, any medical issues or status, cold tolerance and hypothermia. We talk about the escort boat, about their support crew. We even talk about their family and friends and their occupation. We talk about their travel plans, people coming from overseas, and how soon they plan to arrive in the LA area before they swim. If you're coming from a very great distance, you don't want to arrive the day before. We also talk about contingency plans for emergencies, and then answer any questions. So it's quite a detailed interview for people who are coming.
You left out talking about how they pee.
Yeah, well, I categorize that under the medical issues. We did have one swimmer who had been unable to pee, and his family, and this is not a swim I was on myself, but his family insisted that he never peed on swims and that it was okay and that we shouldn't worry about it. And the observers accepted that because, as I say, these are family members, these people who know him and know his swimming better than we did. And unfortunately, due to that problem and various other problems, he ended up in the hospital in the intensive care unit and, again, nearly died. Fortunately, has made a complete recovery. But that is something that I cover under medical issues. I'm not any kind of healthcare professional, but I talk to people who are, and I try to get the best advice I can from them to make sure that we understand the first things that we need to really pay a lot of attention to. The basic
and for
things
like
with, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, the basic things that we're concerned with are the principle that it's better to stay out of trouble than to have to get out of trouble. We're always trying to look ahead, see, well, okay, here we are, we're at this point in the swim, and I'm always trying to think, okay, what would I do if this were to happen? What would we do if that were to happen? And just try to be forehanded about it and think carefully about what our options would be. We've talked with captains in advance, of course, about medical, emergency response issues, things like that. You mentioned other documents that we've written. We also have an observer's toolkit, which is an agenda. We have a meeting before every swim at which first the pilot, the captain, talks about any issues with the boat, how to operate the boat, and what he does and doesn't want done, including, as you also mentioned, things like working systematically with the crew and the support crew, the boat crew and the support crew, to make sure that the engines are in neutral and the propellers are not spinning anytime anybody's getting on or off the boat. Various other kinds of things like that. We have two observers because typically people are then driving home after they get off the boat. And, I've been known to say, if you're doing the Catalina swim without proper experienced people and proper organization, it can be very dangerous. If you're doing it correctly, the most dangerous part of the whole thing, actually, I sincerely believe, is driving home on the freeway after you've been up all day and all night and part of the next day. That's really dangerous. So we want to have two observers so that we have a chance to get a little sleep, because the whole focus is on making good decisions. And people who are sleep deprived are not very good at making good decisions. Another advantage of having two observers, of course, is that means that anytime we have a new observer, we pair them up with an experienced observer so that they are able to apprentice, do some swims with an experienced observer right there to show them how things work, answer questions, guide them as they're developing into experienced observers themselves. We just really don't want to have any gruel-a-thons where somebody's on the ragged edge and they're one aspirated whitecap away from drowning. We are prepared to call a swim before it gets to extremis, where somebody is just on the ragged edge. We think that if that's the case, you need to come back another day when the conditions are better or your training is better or something. We are very, very focused on making sure that people stay safe. No swim is worth dying for, and no swim is worth a trip to the emergency room.
A couple of things, David. So for people who might be aware, we kind of half joke about peeing, but it's not a joking matter. There are a number of complications of swimming around with a full bladder in relatively chilly water. The most easy to understand is your body is going to spend a lot of energy keeping that pee warm, and it's going to deprive the rest of you of that heat. There's 50 other medical reasons why it's not a good idea, but at the very least. Catalina is one of the few big swims that encourages or mandates the use of kayakers or paddlers. Give us some reasons why that is, why you believe it's safer.
Well, and I should say that's really not a federation rule. That's some of the boats require that. We don't actually require that, in part because we recognize, although we certainly recommend it, but we don't actually require it, in part because we recognize that some folks who are swimming Catalina are thinking about doing other swims in places where paddlers are not allowed to be used, such as the English Channel. And so they want to be able to do a Catalina swim without using paddlers. That does happen, although certainly we highly recommend the use of paddlers. There are a couple of things. First of all, as close as you are to a swimmer from the deck of the escort boat going alongside, paddlers are closer. They can hear pretty much everything the swimmer says, whereas people on the big boat typically can't hear over the engines. The other thing is that it means that if the swimmer has a problem, an abrupt problem, that they have a kayak right there, like a meter, 2 meters away from them, that they can grab onto if this needs to happen. I mean, obviously, if that happens, the swim is over, the swimmer is disqualified, but as a safety matter, it means that they have something they can immediately hang on to. And then the third thing is, one of the things that I emphasize in working with swimmers, and especially in the paddler training class that I do, is that you really, as a swimmer, you really want to keep moving and keep your heart rate steady. If you stop, go vertical in the water, and start treading water to have a feeding, your heart rate comes down, you become more prone to hypothermia, also you're wasting time. So the best thing is to have really fast feedings, really quick. One thing I'll tell people is you may not be able to swim like an elite swimmer, but you can feed like they do. You should be able to complete a feeding in about 5 seconds or maybe less. And anything more than that is wasted time. And if you can do that, we'll say, okay, 10, let's call it 10 seconds. but I see people sometimes who will want to take a minute and a half, 2 minutes to take a feeding, and they're stopped and they're chatting and talking and making jokes with the crew and whatnot. That's a waste of time, and that's an opportunity to get cold. People won't notice that at the beginning of a swim in the early feedings, but after you've been in the water for many hours, and you stop for a minute or 2 minutes, you're going to get cold right away, and you are jeopardizing the success of your swim, and also, of course, adding time to the your actual time for the swim. So we really highly encourage people to use paddlers for that reason as well, because you can just feed really fast, feeding from a kayak.
So let me give you a scenario. Somebody learned to swim last year.
Uh-huh.
They've just completed a 5K open water swim.
Yeah.
They've got some money. They've got some family in the Los Angeles area. Yeah. And they apply to swim Catalina in 2021. What happens?
The scenario you've described, we would pretty much automatically consider that to be an inexperienced person who almost certainly cannot be familiar with what actually is going to happen on one of these swims. And one of the things I've been known to say is, so it's the swim actual distance from the usual starting place at Doctor's Cove on Catalina Island to the landing beaches is a little over 20 statute miles, or a little over 32 kilometers. And one thing I've been known to say is 15 or 16 miles, that's about halfway, because you don't know how you're going to react on a 20-mile swim until you've been out to longer distances. Doing a 10K is nothing like enough distance for you to really understand what's going to happen and how it's going to go on a 20-mile swim. So these are people who we would automatically refer to our more intensive review with all those questions for swimmers that I mentioned, and really kind of dig down on their lifetime experience. What's been your swimming experience in your lifetime? What's been your training over your lifetime? What's been the longest swim you've ever done? What's the coldest water you ever swum in? And then answer the same questions for your swimming this year. The longest swim this year, coldest water this year. If you have somebody who swam, English Channel 20 years ago and hasn't done anything since then, well, they have knowledge and they have experience, but they don't have the training. For the case you mentioned, we're going to be working with those people to discuss, and I don't like to say people, you can never do this swim. That would be ridiculous. What I will say is it's clear to me that this is not the swim for you this year. You need to work your way up in gradual steps by doing progressively longer swims. You need to get some experience, and you need to also build up a support group, people that can help you. Trying to just go from the scenario you described to doing something like Catalina or indeed the English Channel, it's a little bit like saying, well, I walked up the trail on a mountain here in California, So therefore, the next thing for me to do is to go climb K2 or Mount Everest. It's like, no, you need to take it in gradual steps. You'll have a better experience, you'll have a far better chance of success, and you'll be much, much safer.
Last question for you. Unfortunately, with COVID, you folks have made the painful decision to cancel your 2020 swims. What were the factors that went into that decision?
Well, this is so just for those who might not possibly have heard, the Catalina Channel Swimming Federation Board of Directors has come to the very difficult decision to cancel the entire 2020 Catalina Channel swimming season. That's something that we on the board wrestled with for months. We have looked forward, hopefully, to the situation improving so much that it would be possible to conduct safe swims. But what we finally came down to is, based on the lack of a vaccine, there's no prospect of a vaccine being ready anytime before New Year's, the infection rates, there were over 1,200 new reported cases of COVID-19 in Los Angeles County yesterday, as per Johns Hopkins University's dashboard. There's growing evidence of airborne transmission and substantial numbers of people who are completely asymptomatic but are infected and are capable of transmitting the virus to others even though they feel fine, they don't have a cough, they don't have a fever. So the questions that I worked through and that we all worked through together, not wanting to come to the conclusion we finally reached, is that first question, has it become clear that social distancing will be necessary throughout the Catalina Channel swimming season? Answer, yes. Second question, can we be confident that it is possible to prevent transmission of the virus by social distancing aboard the escort boat? Answer, no, especially with the prospect of airborne transmission in the cabin and the bunk rooms. Now, the captains have been extremely diligent and thorough in working on ways to improve the safety on their boats. They're wonderful captains, very experienced, thoroughgoing professionals. But the mere fact is, when you're inside the cabin and the bunk room, you're breathing the same air, and you are in a group that includes volunteers who don't all live in the same household and are not accustomed to sharing germs. You have a swimmer, same. You have a boat crew, same. You have two observers, same. And we just think that that's a prospect for airborne transmission. If you look at the news, they're now saying, Dr. Anthony Fauci is saying that airborne transmission is a factor that is more significant than previously thought. So really, between those two, is it clear that social distancing will be necessary, and can we be confident that you can prevent transmission by social distancing? The answer to those questions make it necessary to cancel the swim. Just cancel the season, I should say. We can't responsibly expose people to the possibility of getting sick on a Catalina swim. The next thing is, okay, fine, if that's been decided, then when should we announce that? And the answer is as soon as possible, to give everybody involved as much time as possible to make alternative plans. I have been asked, what gives the Federation the right to decide this? And really the answer to that is safety is at the core of our mission. And making that painful decision after a great deal of soul-searching and discussion, making that decision isn't a right. It's a responsibility, and it's a responsibility that we all take very seriously. So very sorry that we had to do that. We are extending all annual memberships in the Federation and senior annual memberships to the Federation. They will be extended to last through the end of 2021. So we're adding a year's membership for everybody. Anybody who has already signed up to swim has the choice of either postponing their swim without any additional charges, postponing until 2021, or if they choose to cancel their swim and ask for a refund, we will refund all of their funds, including we will not deduct for PayPal fees. The Federation will absorb the costs of fees for PayPal funds transfers, so they will get back every penny that they've spent with us. We feel it's the least we can do, and we hope very much to see everybody back in 2021. The swimmers who have actually completed applications, the word we've been hearing back from folks who's already signed up to swim is everybody is, of course, very, very disappointed, as are we all, but they have understood that this is a tough decision but a necessary one, and almost all of them are planning on postponing until 2021, and we hope to see them then.
So thank you very much for your time tonight.